You're listening to episode 4 of the Emerging Leader podcast. Thanks for joining for this episode. It's a super exciting topic where I'm going to be talking all about identity. And identity is actually one of the really critical topics that I first learned when I was going into the kind of this self-development phase of my life. And honestly, it completely transformed the way that I look at goal setting, habits, and basically anything that I want to change in my life. As now, obviously, I realize that it has everything to do with identity. I wanted to start out with an episode like this early on in the podcast because it is such a crucial concept for any change in your life, whether that's in your career or in your health or in your financial situation. Everything is related to identity and how do you actually change that to make lasting change in your life. Personally, when I first learned about this, I was so frustrated with myself because I just couldn't seem to get momentum with habits. I would often start something and then I would trail off or I would completely ditch it. It was the same with career ideas that I had or like new projects at work. It was the same with health and just generally any habits. And I was just so frustrated with myself as to like, why can't I make this work? Like I know what I need to do, but why can't I have any continuity or momentum in actually achieving that and doing that? And once I realized that identity was a key reason for this, it completely transformed my life. So I'm super glad that you're joining me on this episode of the Emerging Leader podcast. I really hope that you enjoy and hope that you can take away from this a lot of knowledge about identity and how it actually is affecting your life right now, as well as a framework that I use so that I can actually achieve the habits or do the habits that I want to do and achieve the things that I want to achieve in my life. So stay tuned. The Emerging Leader podcast. So first of all, what is identity? So it really, and I'm reading here off of a definition that I have, refers to the unique characteristics and qualities that define an individual, including beliefs, values, personality traits, and self-perception. So personally, for me, I have an identity of being Canadian, of being an engineer, being someone who's successful in my career, who can do the things that I want to do and, is relatively outgoing, not scared to have hard conversations, someone who cares about my health, who's adventurous, etc. So these are all things that are in my identity, but these things have had to come into my identity. They were definitely not always like this. When I was growing up, I had the identity of being a very shy kid, like quite reserved. I spent most of my childhood school years in the library or doing things like that. So I felt quite reserved. So to now have an identity of being outgoing and willing to really put myself out there has completely shifted. So I first heard about this quite a few years ago in a podcast by a coach named Jim Fortin. And he has this amazing quote that I love that I've put on my page before, which is that you cannot outperform your identity, meaning that sure, you might have like willpower that gets you a couple of weeks into these habits and gets you into the gym or gets you doing what you want. But ultimately, if your identity doesn't align with what you're actually trying to do, you're going to have a really hard time outperforming that. And hearing this was just really, really crazy to me. I was like, wow, how do I change my identity so that it helps me rather than hinders me? And that's ultimately what we're going to talk about today. So in his podcast, he gives this great example and a classic example of being a smoker. If you're not a smoker, it's not part of your identity, you don't have to actually convince yourself not to smoke. It's just who you are. And likewise, if you're really healthy or if you go to the gym, like that's probably just part of who you are. You don't really have to convince yourself that much to do it. And that's not to say that it doesn't take discipline or motivation, of course. But ultimately, having it as a part of your identity makes it much easier for you to find the activation energy and intrinsic motivation to actually do that thing. Like for me, it doesn't take a lot of motivation to not smoke because I'm not a smoker and I haven't smoked and it's not part of my identity. Which this is precisely why people find it hard to make this lasting change if their identity conflicts with the action that they're trying to do. Like for me, to force myself to smoke would be really hard because one, like I'm just not into that, but it's just not part of my identity. So it would be really hard for me to actively try and do that. And another concept that he has, which I'll tie all of this back together, is that in this case, people are too focused on doing rather than being. So like, let me try and go to the gym. That's the doing part. And how do I just force myself there? How do I try and get there 3 or 4 times a week? And really trying to just use all of the willpower versus who do I have to be the type of person that goes to the gym regularly or as much as I want. This is also referred to in an amazing book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, where he talks about having identity-based habits, and ultimately very similar concept how, yes, like you can try and have the willpower to just push yourself to do these new things or to be this new person or, you know, to do this new thing at your job or to be healthy or to quit smoking or to put out a podcast or any of these things. But ultimately, if you don't have the identity that matches that, it's going to be really, really hard for you. So again, referring back to that intrinsic motivation that comes when your identity actually aligns with what you're trying to do, and also has the opposite effect where subconsciously your identity will pull you back towards what it knows you to be versus what you want to be, maybe more consciously. Which another classic example of this is when people who have been, I guess, quite poor throughout their whole life win the lottery. And then they find themselves back in that situation again a few years later. It's largely to do with their identity and subconsciously how they might actually be sabotaging their financial success after that to become closer again to their identity. So in James's book, he references an example where he says, instead of saying, I want to run a marathon, say, I am a runner. A runner is a person who runs marathons. So again, while that is quite simple language, it's really a huge shift between being someone or just someone who's doing something. So it sounds like it's really a fragment of language, you know, like how can this actually make such a huge difference? And I'll get into some examples personally and how this has worked for me. But honestly, if you can create a lasting identity shift in your life, then that is how you'll create lasting change. Another great quote from Atomic Habits that I love is he suggests that you ask yourself, what type of person do I want to become? Who do I want to be in this? And it's very similar to what Jim Fortin said. Who do I want to be? What type of person do I want to become? And then aligning your actions with that, and identity, actions, and outcomes. That's kind of how that works out. And similarly, the habit loop that he talks about, where you have like a cue, a craving, and a response. And that response is ultimately what is determined by your identity. Because sure, you might have a cue or you might have a craving. Like me, it's, you know, sweet foods at night, chocolate, always. But depending on my identity at that time, I might be a person that like, no, I just don't eat chocolate at night. Or, which is currently the case, I am a person who eats chocolate at night. And if I wanted to change that, then I would have to really change that cue and also the identity so that my response to the cue and the craving is different. Currently, the cue is that I finish dinner and then I'm like, okay, I just want some chocolate. So I would have to change that response at an identity level to actually create anything that's really lasting versus just trying to force myself through sheer willpower to not eat the chocolate, which I've tried and has not been very successful. So like I said, ultimately to have lasting change, your identity must be aligned with your habits. And also that's how you get that intrinsic motivation to actually do something versus just trying to willpower and force yourself to do what you think you can do, which ultimately does work for some people. And sometimes it works to kind of push you over that hill until your identity changes, but it's a tough slog. So if there's an easier way to do it, then of course, that's what we prefer. So Jim Fortin also has this super amazing concept, which I love, called the be, do, have concept. So traditionally, he says that people are focused on the opposite: have, do, be. Once I have this thing, then I'll be able to do what I want, and then I'll be able to be the person that I want to be. So, for example, if I have more money, then I'll be able to go on more holidays, and then then I won't be so stressed all the time, or then I'll be more patient with my family, or then I'll be this. When in reality, it's quite the opposite. And that's what he suggests. It's completely backwards thinking. Instead, it should be, who do I have to be to do the things that I want to do, to have the thing that I want? And that's where the opposite is a trap, because since there's been no identity shift, even if you get the money, even if you do go on the vacations, will you be less stressed, or will you be more patient with your family? Probably not, because you haven't had the identity shift to actually align with who that person is that would be more patient or would be less stressed with their family and that sort of thing, which again, like, not to use the gym example so many times, but it's something that all of us can relate to. It's exactly why you go and you don't end up sticking to it, because you're not the type of person who goes to the gym regularly at an identity level. And much of this is subconscious, which is why we find ourselves falling into very similar patterns, no matter how many times we try and pull ourselves out of that. It's like, geez, like, why am I procrastinating again? Why am I eating chocolate again? Why am I skipping the gym again? It's because subconsciously, that's who we're being pulled back to. It's this identity. It's a safety layer of feeling safe being that type of person because it's been successful for you so far, or that's subconsciously what it feels like, even though on the surface and consciously, you know that you want to be someone else or do something different. So personally, I've experienced this, like I mentioned, in almost every area of my life, but specifically in my career. I mean, yes, I've experienced it in health, financially, health goals, relationship goals, everything. But career is like such a critical example. And this is something that I share with anyone who's willing to listen about, how do you get promoted? How do you get into a new role? And this is exactly what I say to them. So it's super critical. And if there's only one thing you take away from this, please let it be this example about, instead of being like, well, once I have that, then I'll be able to do the things I want. And then I'll be able to be that person. It's completely in reverse. So who do I have to be in order to do the things I know I need to do to have what I want? So if you are looking for a promotion or looking for a new role, who would you have to be in that new role? And I'm not saying you like take on massive responsibility, but also speaking as like a hiring manager myself, I'm not going to hire people or promote people strictly on potential. They have to demonstrate some of these traits that they're looking for in the next role or in the new thing. It's the same in any company, more or less, that you have to actually demonstrate that stuff through who you are and therefore what you're actively doing. So this has been super transformational for me and is absolutely, I give a lot of credit to this for who I've been throughout my career, and ultimately the reason that I've been able to move in such a, I guess, like fast-paced direction into being a manager of a very large team. So like I said, while of course you're going to grow and learn when you're actually in that role, you have to ask yourself now, who would I have to be to do the things that I want to do or need to do to then have that promotion, and start acting as that person now and start working on those identity shifts now. Like I said, this is probably one of the most critical things that I've used in my own career, in addition to being fully responsible for the outcome, which we'll cover separately, but absolutely very critical, which this also very closely ties into personal brand, which is unbelievably important in life. As much as we don't want it to be, it is. So who do you want to be known as? Personally, what do you think you want to be? What do you want to know yourself as? How can you be counted on by people? What do you want other people to say about you when, you come up in conversation? These sorts of things. And this is where identity is also very closely linked with your brand. So if you're looking for a promotion or if you're looking at different things like that, what do you want to be known as? Is it someone who stays true to their word, who is dependable, who's creative, who comes up with really interesting solutions? What is it that you want to be known for? And try and work that into this identity piece and start being that person now before doing the things. Because if you just start to try doing without the identity work below it, you're going to run out of willpower and be very frustrated and not get the result that you're looking for. So this is a really critical piece of work and is actually something that I do personally if there's any change that I'm trying to seek in my life. So for example, even starting this podcast, I asked myself, who do I have to be in order to do this? Because if I don't do that work, if it doesn't match with my identity, then I might release 1 episode or 2 episodes, but then I'm going to get busy, or I'm just going to, forget about it, or be too scared, or not be consistent. And all of these things will lead to the demise of the podcast. So it's really important that I'm actually being the person who releases a consistent podcast that grows and helps people before I can actually start. And it's something that, of course, isn't perfect from day one. Like, I'm definitely not the Ashley who's going to be releasing podcasts 2 years from now. I don't even know who that is, but I have to think about that and act in that direction, which will ultimately help me get to that point as well. So let's do a bit of an example. For example, getting a bigger role or a promotion or that next kind of change in your career that you want to seek. So following that be, do, have method, who do you have to be to make it happen? Is it consistent? Is it true to your word, proactive, responsible for the outcome, a more mature communicator, outgoing, easily building relationships with key stakeholders, the ability to have tough conversations? So these are some of the identity traits that you would have to embody, potentially, depending on the role, to get into that next step, into that next level. So what do you have to do to actually make that happen? So yes, there's the identity piece, but there's also things that you can do to help the identity piece, like learning and books and courses. But also, if you just want to read books, you have to be the type of person that finishes the book and also puts the book into action, because a lot of people read books, a lot of people do courses, myself included, but unless you're the type to actually really embody that, it's not going to work. So you can see again how the identity ties into this. Regardless, going back to it, so what do you actually have to do to make that happen? You've got to finish the projects you're in charge of, be proactive in raising issues or suggestions for improvement, practicing your communication, potentially managing up, maybe reading books or taking courses like I mentioned, regularly communicating with those key stakeholders, openly asking for feedback, which is always a tough one, but also in order to openly ask for feedback, who do you have to be? Perhaps someone who is not scared to have the hard conversation or is also not going to take things personally. So you can see how those two things are aligned. Yeah. And I guess just generally being open with other people in the roles, or who's currently in the role, or who's on your team that can give you this feedback. So this is something that I do nonstop. Whenever I want to make a change in my life, I'm constantly asking myself, who do I have to be to actually create a lasting change in this area of my life, versus just trying to brute force, just do the thing repeatedly, which again, sometimes works, but also I don't have a lot of willpower. So I'd rather do what's easiest for me. So like I said, this is where it gets really interesting, because you can consciously try and change your identity and you're still going to struggle, because subconsciously, and that's where this subconscious identity pulls you back into being in this safe zone of what you normally do or who you normally are, and all of what's normal. Even if it's not the level that you personally know you can achieve, it's still what's safe for your brain and what you've been doing up to this point. So it tries to pull you back to that. But in the subconscious, that's where we can really make those changes. And this is where it gets a bit crazy, and was something that, again, completely changed my life when I started learning about this, specifically in this book. It's by Joseph Murphy. I'll link it below. It's quite old and like very old. So don't focus on the language, focus on the concept. It's called The Power of Your Subconscious Mind. And it summarizes this concept incredibly well. And I've read it so many times, but it's really about how do you actually change your subconscious, and how if you don't, then you keep getting pulled back to whatever is in your subconscious mind. So how do we actually change this? Depending on who you ask, they might say you need to put sticky notes around your house, or you need to shout affirmations in the mirror, which might not be the best approach. It might be quite therapeutic to shout at yourself in the mirror. And I'm definitely not a stranger to that either, but it's perhaps not the best approach. So the most effective approach that I've personally found is through hypnotherapy or hypnosis, which is basically where you're pulling your brain into like a different state. So a really relaxed state where you can actually reprogram your subconscious mind. And it sounds crazy. And people have different opinions about hypnosis. Personally, what really changed my mind about it, obviously, other than my own personal experience with it, was hearing about people doing like root canals and crazy dentistry with just hypnosis. So no anesthetic or anything. That was crazy to me. So that definitely made me a believer in addition to obviously my own experience with it. So there are a few, obviously, methods of hypnosis or hypnotherapy. So there's in person with an actual therapist, which I've done, and that's been absolutely exceptional. A couple of things. One, it's very expensive. And two, the best therapists are booked out like 6 months in advance. So it's not super accessible for everyone. The second one is through self-hypnosis. So that's where, again, you might listen to an audio for a while and kind of train yourself to go into self-hypnosis, or bring your brain into the state where it can kind of be retrained, and then you do visualizations from there. Also possible, but not my favorite method. The final method, which is kind of tied to the self-hypnosis, but a bit different, is just through audio hypnosis. So through an app or different recordings online, you can literally Google them. There's thousands and thousands of them. And this has absolutely been my favorite method so far. So my favorite app for audio hypnosis is by a guy named Darren Marks, who I think he's in the UK. He's an amazing hypnotherapist, and his app is called Harmony Hypnosis, which I'll link below. And he basically has all different themes of audios, whether that's fears and phobias, or like quitting bad habits, like biting your nails or smoking or those sorts of things, as well as more positive ones about relaxing, stopping procrastination, visualizing yourself in the future, like beyond when, you've lost weight, or when you started the business you wanted to start, or you got the promotion, all of these things, as well as like weight loss and cutting sugar cravings and all of these things. So while they're specific in nature, more or less, they're not specific to you, but that's what's so amazing about these audios, is he really gets your brain into a state, and then it's all about you visualizing your future self, or you doing the thing that you physically want to do, but retraining your brain to make that really normal for you. And personally, I've found great success through these audios. I really like Darren's style in his hypnosis, and it's been really great and super accessible, just through an app that you listen to it whenever you want during the day. Obviously not while you're driving. Personally, I just do it before I go to sleep, and it's been really amazing. So whether you want to make a change through, brute force and just willpower, or if you want to actually see a hypnotherapist, and I can recommend one in Sydney for sure, who I've dealt with. Otherwise, I think even a lot of them do Zoom sessions, like even Darren Marks, I think, does Zoom sessions out of the UK, which is quite successful, or just through the app like Harmony. It's an amazing app and definitely what I use. But if you're wanting to make this sort of change, I would definitely recommend you try it. Like, don't knock it till you try it. If nothing else, you'll be listening to a relaxing audio at night and visualizing your future self, which I find like a really positive and empowering experience. So it's probably worth it regardless. And I think you can get a free trial with the app anyways. So no harm in doing that. But to summarize, and I hope that despite all of the varied examples and kind of hoops I've been jumping through here, you understand that you cannot outperform your identity. You must be the person first in order to do the things you want to do, to have what you want. Jim Fortin's model of be, do, have versus have, do, be, which so many people do, which is why they get stuck in these loops and don't actually achieve the things that they want to achieve, or find themselves falling out of the habits that they so desperately want themselves to stick to. So personally, I would go through that exercise whenever there's a change you want to make, or even just generally in your life. Like, who do you want to be? Not what do you want to do, but who do you want to be? Who do you have to be in order to do those things as well? I've linked all of my favorite books on this in the show notes, as well as Jim Fortin's podcast where I first learned about this, as well as the Darren Marks app. So if you have any questions on hypnosis or my experience in this, please absolutely reach out, and I would love to share any and all resources and suggestions with you. We'd also love for you to share about what's resonated with you in this episode, or if there's anything you're actually struggling with on the identity front. And hopefully this has been as groundbreaking or like cracking your brain open like it did for me, because personally, like I said, I was just really frustrated with myself. Like, why can't I do these things? Why can't I just get myself to do the habits or do the things I want to do? Why am I procrastinating? Why am I quitting these things? And so learning about this really transformed that, and is a huge reason why I'm here in this position today. So as always, would love your feedback on the episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already, or leave a comment on Spotify or Apple. That always means a lot. And yeah, thank you for your support on the podcast so far. And I really hope to see you on the next episode. Thanks, and stay tuned. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are listening to the podcast.